Carl, you're first up. So I'm not sure that Carl actually requires too much introduction, given that he's the current president of Scottish PEN, and we've asked him, because of that role that he's had for the last few years, to give us some of his reflections on PEN as it is now, and I guess implicit in that will be some thoughts about where he feels PEN is going in the future. So we're delighted that you've joined us, Carl, and we're excited to hear what you have to say. Can I pass over to you now?
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here at last, and welcome to my kitchen. Believe it or not, it's almost 60 years since Bob Dylan told us that the times were changing. These days, some of us believe they're not changing fast enough. Others believe they haven't changed at all, while I'm sure there are still more who believe that things have changed for the worst. We believe in a time when journalists are murdered for doing their job, when writers are feared of exploring, not simply because of what they might find, but because the means of exploration could land them in jail. When truth is apparently variable and simple dignity and respect are at a premium. We live in a time when basic freedoms are challenged daily in our media and on our streets. When the majority of people get their news from organisations that have little or nothing to do with news. When anyone can speak and their words of value and are given currency, not because of anything inherent, nor even because of any democratic principle or integrity, but because it is business, among the biggest the world has ever known, masquerading as democracy, masquerading as news. We live in a time when the concept of service has all but disappeared from public life. When we watch these things we believe in, things we have known all our lives and into which some of us were born, being threatened for no reason other than profit. As individuals, we're affected by events over which we feel we have little or no control and long for something better. So we come to Scottish PEN to give our voice a collective thrust, to record a desire for change, or simply to highlight injustice, fear, prejudice, and basic inequality. But just before I kind of remind myself what I'm supposed to be talking about, I want to quote the PEN Charter. Item 4 says, and I will quote it in full, PEN stands for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought within each nation and between all nations, and members pledge themselves to oppose any form of suppression of freedom of expression in the country and community to which they belong, as well as throughout the world, wherever this is possible. PEN declares for a free press and opposes arbitrary censorship in time of peace. It believes that the necessary advance of the world towards a more highly organised political and economic order renders a free criticism of governments, administrations and institutions imperative. And since freedom implies voluntary restraint, members pledge themselves to oppose such evils of a free press as mendacious publication, deliberate falsehood, and distortion of facts for political and personal ends. Simply, that's who we are. And as James Baldwin reminded us, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Giving a list of what we've done is easy enough, but even if I skip across the peaks, it will give you no idea of the amount of work we actually do. The emails, the conversations, phone calls, meetings and writing of one sort or another. And we do at its heart something for which I believe writers are uniquely qualified. We give a voice to those whose voices have been silenced, and we speak on behalf of people who cannot speak for themselves. Which means we often go to where we're neither invited nor wanted. We go to where we think we're needed, and we highlight things others would comfortably hide and hope to remain hidden. And nothing happens overnight. There are very few immediate changes. If change comes at all, it is usually a slow, deliberate process. We tried, for example, to influence policy and support conversations that are of national importance to writers. And I'm going to highlight 3 recent and continuing areas where this has been the case. Our defamation reform campaign, our response to the hate crime bill, and the publication earlier this year of our declarations anthology. Defamation reform is something we've been working on for 7 years. Our campaign began under the presidency of my predecessor, Drew Campbell. And we have campaigned to change the laws of our country, not alone, not without sympathetic voices or help, but Scottish Pen in particular can claim credit for initiating the defamation reform campaign, for staying the course. And we're now on the cusp of changing our country's law. England changed their defamation law in 2012, and our campaign began in 2013. The overall aim was to update and reform our defamation law so that it accurately reflects the contemporary changing media landscape and offers effective protection for freedom of expression, that it ensures reputations can be protected in an equitable manner that is open to everyone and is not the sole preserve of the rich and powerful, that it provides safeguards for individuals from companies or those with powerful interests seeking to silence reasonable criticism and comment. Our website, which is scottishpen.org, in this case, /defamation, gives a detailed account and timetable of these events, as well as our other campaigns and activities. But having been postponed because of coronavirus, last month, one of our Board of Trustees, Andrew Tickell, gave a submission at the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill Call for Evidence. In an email to the board afterwards, he said, "The positive news is that our submission has clearly set the agenda for the committee's scrutiny of the bill in important ways, including on the role of corporations, the ability of private companies delivering public services, and our innovative proposal that we should incorporate a new legal action of unjustifiable threats into Scots law." The bill features in the Scottish Government's programme of legislation for the coming year, and you can rest assured we will be watching and reporting on its progress. And next month, the Scottish Government plan to start hearing evidence on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. Scottish Pen has submitted a response to the Justice Committee's call for views. Our response focuses on the rights of writers to express themselves freely and without fear. While the implications of the bill are varied, our submission is based on a recognition of the serious harm hate crime causes in our society as a whole and the impact it has on writers' ability to live according to their beliefs, their individual identities and values, to give them the right, like everyone else, to live free of fear or censorship on and off the page. We absolutely welcome the principle of reconciling Scotland's fragmented legislation on hate crimes into a single piece of legislation, which can only lead to the law becoming more transparent and can give citizens a better understanding of their rights. We also recognise the importance of protecting forms of art and literature, some might consider provocative, pieces that communicate different social perspectives and challenge conventional outlooks. We also strongly support the abolition of the common law crime of blasphemy. Again, our full submission's on the website, and we hope to play a similarly active role as we did with defamation. Our website is where you'll find details of the evidence, our evidence to the committee, and other relevancies. We're acutely aware of the fact that many writers' right to freedom of expression is put at risk because they live with a fearful awareness and often direct experience of hate crime. We are also aware that some offences proposed in the bill could induce a climate of self-censorship and suppression of any writing that challenges power or subverts what could be seen, however self-servingly or narrowly, as societal norms. And we hope that our response balances both of these points in a constructive way with a defence of free expression at its heart. Which brings me to Declarations, an anthology of poetry and prose exploring freedom of expression. It marks the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Broth, in which the Scottish nobility appealed to the Pope to support the nation's fight for freedom. And as I've already indicated, it comes at a time when the need to hear and to understand each other is as urgent as ever it was. We've recently instigated an Amplify Black Voices series of blogs and invite members' contributions. The current issue of our online journal, Pennings, which is produced by our Writers in Exile Committee, features the Hong Kong-based writer Hon Lai Chu. She covers the topic of patience with courage and dignity. Penning is open to writers living in Scotland whose first language is neither Scots, Gaelic nor English, and their work will appear alongside writing by Scottish PEN members. Our Writers for Peace Committee has been invited to join PEN Norway and Wales's PEN Cymru in the campaign to release the Kurdish writer Ilhan Sami Çomak. Ilhan is Turkey's longest serving student prisoner, having served 26 years of a life sentence. He was arrested in 1994 while studying at Istanbul University, and after 19 days of continuous torture, he signed a statement that is the sole piece of evidence in this case. And on the 28th of July, our Board of Trustees and Writers at Risk Committee jointly wrote to Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, and to the Indian High Commission of India, in support of the imprisoned writer Vara Vara Rao, who is 80 years old and in poor health. He was imprisoned in 2018 and released to hospital recently, where he has tested positively for COVID-19. Visiting relatives found him unattended and delirious on a urine-soaked bed. Our Writers at Risk Committee also supports the Ugandan academic and poet Dr. Stella Nyanzi and the Palestinian poet Ashraf Fayyad, with whom Saudi Arabian court sentenced to death by beheading, basically for changing his religion. Following international protests, his sentence was commuted to 8 years in prison and 800 lashes. Ashraf Fayyad isn't a Saudi citizen, unlike Raif Badawi, who was arrested on a charge of apostasy, along with other charges including insulting Islam through electronic channels. He was a blogger. Raif Badawi was arrested in 2012 and the following year was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison and 600 lashes. Following an appeal in 2014, his sentence was increased to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes and a fine. The first 50 lashes were administered publicly in a Jeddah square in January 2015, and subsequent floggings have been postponed more than a dozen times. Now, while it's easy to condemn such barbarity, it's also easy and often convenient to ignore threats to writers that happen nearer home. Earlier this year, Amy Fenton, who is South Cumbria's chief reporter for the Mail and based on Barrow and Furness. The Mail, by the way, is a local paper. She was forced to flee her home and has subsequently been under police protection. On the 23rd of May, the Mail published a report by Amy Fenton concerning a woman who had been charged with perverting the course of justice. And following publication, Fenton reportedly received, and again I quote, in excess of 100 death threats and threats of unlawful violence, both on and offline. Her byline was subsequently removed from the article due to the volume of abuse she had received. The following day, having assessed the threats and believing there was a credible risk to her life and to that of her young daughter, police advised Fenton to leave her family home, and she has since been staying in a secret location and under constant police protection. Penn has called for an end to the harassment of Amy Fenton and stands with her and many journalists in the UK who are facing increased level of threats for doing their jobs. We further call on the UK government to live up to its obligations under UK and international law to ensure journalists are protected and that a free press can thrive. We do this at a time when we are in touch with other UK pen centres and Pen International over recent reports that the Council of Europe has issued a media freedom alert over the UK government's blacklisting of investigative journalists. And this week I signed personally and on behalf of Scottish Pen a statement that originated with English Pen on the dangerous and worsening situation in Belarus. Well, it isn't all bad news. In July this year, Baruch Buchani, who had his refugee status formally recognised by New Zealand and has been granted a one-year work visa, which allows him to apply for permanent residency and ultimately for citizenship. Buchani fled Iran and sought Australian citizenship. In January last year, his memoir, No Friend But the Mountains, won both of Australia's important literary awards. The book was tapped out in a series of single messages on a mobile phone and was being translated from Persian into English. The co-chair of our Writers at Risk Committee, Jane Archer, presented a copy to Nicola Sturgeon at last year's Day of the Imprisoned Writer event in the Scottish Parliament. The fact that hope doesn't always arrive directly, but it can come from difficult and unlikely sources, comes with something that all governments should recognise. You can't change the past, and you can't change the truth. For example, I'm sure that by murdering the Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, the perpetrators hoped to silence criticism and to pose a threat across the European community, as well as giving a lead to similarly minded bullies. The result has been a number of arrests, and the Maltese Prime Minister has resigned, but is still accountable for his actions, and his past, like yours and mine, will not go away. So the warnings have changed. Your past is prologue, and lies and obfuscation can't change it. By killing Daphne Caruana Galizia, her murderers have given her cause an international dimension it would otherwise have been difficult to achieve, and have in fact won her case for her. And for that, I'm going to offer no thanks on anyone's behalf, far less greet it with any kind of respect. Scottish Pen work in solidarity with press freedom and human rights organisations internationally, joining organisations such as the Anti-Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, who go under the interesting acronym SLAPS. In the coming months, we'll be undertaking research and interviews exploring the theme of freedom and expression and public protest in Scotland. We're looking forward to the Women Writers Committee's Naomi Hutcheson lecture and our Day of the Imprisoned Writer event, as well as following our Hate Speech and Media Symposia with a proposed publication symposium, and of all's well to resume a conversation with the Scottish Prison Service about taking writers into prisons. Finally, No one could do this job without the continual help and support from our Board of Trustees, and I am grateful to them beyond measure. And on their behalf, I want to thank our project manager, Lisa Clark, to whom already we owe an enormous debt of gratitude. I would also like to thank everyone who, like the board, give up their time voluntarily to work on our committees. So this is where we are and where we hope to be. I've already highlighted what can't be changed, and I'll leave you with the belief that things can change, starting with our thinking and our actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Carl. That was absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant to hear of all the kind of current campaigns and the tremendous kind of international reach of the organization as it stands, both the achievements as well as obviously some of the extraordinary challenges and dreadful challenges that you're, as you say, facing up to. So I'm sure there were quite a few virtual rounds of applause there for you, which you may or may not as you were talking. If it's all right with you, Carl, I sent you a quick message, but I think what we'll do, so just kind of mindful of the time on the schedule. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to ask people to sort of hang on to their questions and take them to the panel session, which is scheduled for 4:15. So that will allow us to gather the questions from the various presentations and turn them into our discussion. So if that's okay with you, we'll...
Absolutely, fine, yeah.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Carl. So as I'm speaking, my technical assistant is putting the slides up on the screen. Is it possible to go to slideshow, Gerry? Or
I've put them on, Helen. Can you see them at this point?
I can see them, but can you put them on slideshow?
I'm just terrified to do anything. Remind me how I do that. He said.
So just go up to where the arrow is on the menus, and there's view, review, slideshow. Oh, yeah. Click on slideshow.
Yes.
Slideshow, and then from beginning. So go right along to the left.
Yeah, oh yes, sorry, yeah.
I click on there, and then you should be able to, I think we've cut off the end of the bits, but that's fine, that's great, just, yeah, that's fine. Brilliant, thank you very much for coordinating that. So as I said at the beginning, this project is being kind of carried out by Gerry and myself, and we decided to, for want of any other kind of overview, to divide the research into two historical sections. So I began looking at the founding of Scottish Pen and the years really up to, but not including, the 1950 Congress. So what I'm presenting today is a very small amount of that research and a kind of overview of it, really not a huge amount of granular detail, although there's a little bit included in the slides here. Can I just check again that you can hear me? See a few nods, is that okay? Great, thank you. So just going to the first slide, Gerry, so the next, just where you went to there, that's brilliant. So I'm looking initially at the founding of Scottish Pen, and I managed to get hold of the sort of the document, the constitution document that initiates the first pen organisation in Scotland. I'm going to have a look at that document and think a little bit in particular about Hugh Mcdermott or Christopher Grieve, which is the name, so he's always referred to as Grieve or Christopher Grieve, Grieve in the pen, in the context of pen. I'll look a bit at Mcdermott's influence and think about what it was, and move from that to thinking about the relationship between pen and the so-called kind of Scottish Renaissance, Scottish literary Renaissance of the 1930s, and the role of pen in kind of establishing a distinctive Scottish literary culture, and vice versa. And I've got a few figures that give us a profile of the membership of PEN as it grew and slightly fell in the 1940s, not surprisingly. So I'll share those statistics with you. So Gerry, could you flick on to the next slide for me? Thanks very much. So what I found in the archive, actually mainly in the British Library archive, I found PEN News, which was a really good resource for me because there was a report every month or so of what was happening in PEN International, but included in that a regular write-up of the Scottish Centre. So quite a lot of the information I have in this presentation is taken from those PEN News documents, as well as the National Library of Scotland documents. But in the collected letters of Hugh Mcdermott, there's a relevant letter from the 16th of May 1927, which is from Mcdermott to Neil Gunn. And in the letter, he says that this move is afoot, that he's been asked, John Goldsworthy, it seems that the origin of the idea was John Goldsworthy, who initially approached Herbert Greerson from the University of Edinburgh to found a Scottish centre. But Greerson, for whatever reasons, was busy, although he did go on to occupy president and honorary president roles. But he couldn't at the time, and he contacted Mcdermott, as he says, as the only member, I think, regularly resident in Scotland. He wasn't at the time able to work on it, but eventually did work on the setting up of the first Scottish PEN. And what he says about it, I think, is really interesting. So in the letter to Gunn, he says, the literary life of Scotland is not being concentrated in any one city. It is, or as it is not concentrated in any one city, it's proposed to do has been successfully done in certain other countries and establish a national centre with sections in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And membership of the centre would carry with it membership of both sections and international PEN. And that sectioning of Scottish PEN is something I'm going to come back to. But if you look at, and this is actually not appearing on the slide for formatting reasons, but there were 20 members initially, and those included Lady Margaret Sackville, a poet, Greerson himself, Professor Entwistle, who was a Hispanic professor of Hispanic at Edinburgh University, Lewis Spence, who was a journalist and a poet, as well as a founder of the Scottish National Movement, William Power, Isabel Hutcheson, who's an incredible figure, an Arctic explorer and a botanist, as well as Gunn, obviously, and Mcdermott. So by October of 1927, Scottish PEN is listed in PEN News as one of the centres. So that's the first time it's listed and publicised. So very quickly, the centre is established. Can I move on to the next slide, Gerry? Thank you. And as I said, this information comes from the sort of constitution, the documents which constitutes Scottish PEN and declares its rules and structures. And what I think is very interesting is this sense of it being founded in sections, and not just Glasgow and Edinburgh, but multiple other sections. So what you see in the founding of Scottish PEN is a sense not just of Scotland's distinctiveness, but its diversity, its distinction through diversity, and diversity of region and language as well. And I think it's very striking that if you look at the list of countries who have a PEN organisation, there's no other country with a population as small as Scotland which has these multiple sections and multiple centres. especially two centres which are actually quite close together geographically, Glasgow and Edinburgh. So in the founding document, it makes clear that Glasgow and Edinburgh will have a section each represented by 6 members, but there will also be a section for Gaelic language, and so a non-geographic in some ways section, but a language-based section, but also Inverness, Aberdeen and Dundee. Each of those will have a representative in Scottish Pen. And it's interesting that those are part of the Constitution, but when you look at what's happening in terms of the events of Pen of the late 20s, the 30s and the 40s, these other sections are there kind of in theory, but there's not a huge amount of activity and reporting from those diverse sections. But I suppose the question I had, or maybe what was confirmed in my mind, and I'm not sure if this is completely right, but it feels as though that sectioning of Pen does reflect what we know about Hugh Mcdermott, known for his kind of much more regional rather than cosmopolitan approach to literary modernism during this period. And so the more geographically dispersed nature of the Scottish literary Renaissance of the 30s seems to be mirrored in this this way in which the organisation is at least initially structured. And it's very striking that many of the Pen members were also the prominent figures in that literary renaissance of the 1930s. And I don't want to overestimate Mcdermott's kind of influence, because obviously there were these other figures involved, but it feels as though they, at least initially, may have shared this vision, although perhaps not for, not without some protest or some tension, because as you see from the next point in the slide, Mcdermott was very short-lived in terms of his official kind of role in Pen. He has a letter of resignation in 1929, which says, and again, this is a little bit cut off on the screen, so I'll just read it out. So February 1929, so he's only really the honorary secretary for just over a year, but he says increasing pressure of work caused him to resign, but also he says, I live too far away from the centre or centres of things in Scotland. Obviously he was based in Montrose, or he lived in Montrose, too far away to carry out the duties as effectively as I would desire. And also to my recognition of the fact that while my services may have been helpful in the initiation of the centre, a secretary who is less of a stormy petrel than I am may be more successful at wielding the scattered elements of literary Scotland into such a homogeneous whole as would enable the Scottish centre to compare favourably with the centres in other countries. And I think that language is very telling, that idea, almost the kind of judgment implicit there, that he values that scatteredness of Scottish literary culture and was perhaps resisting or fighting against what he saw as its homogeneity of its being drawn constantly back to the centre or the two centres of Glasgow and Edinburgh. So I'll leave that those lines in there for you to think about. But I also wanted to draw your attention to, thank you, Gerry, the next slide, which is the visit of John Goldsworthy. So the Pen Centre is set up late 1927, and almost immediately there's a dinner in Edinburgh, and John Goldsworthy is the honoured guest. And the dinner is presided over by Margaret Saville, and there's a report of this in Pen News. So this is kind of secondhand. These are not direct quotations from either Sackville or Goldsworthy, But Saville describes Penn, there's a kind of tongue-in-cheekness about everything that's being said here, which is interesting in itself, this indirectness of humour that's being deployed. She describes Scottish Penn as a very audacious infant in aspiring at so early a stage in its career to so illustrious a guest, Goldsworthy, but their success justified their audacity. And Goldsworthy says then that he was very glad that Penn had conquered at last the invincible race he saw at the table, in brackets, laughter. It was natural, it was fitting that Edinburgh and Glasgow, which should distrust an idea which emanated from London. So there's this kind of humor which is based on this kind of jokey acknowledgement of cultural difference, national difference between and national rivalries between Scotland and England, which are obviously very much both in the background and the foreground of this event. And the report also has Goldsworthy said that he hoped that there was nobody would think that they of the Penn Club believed that the vital spark of literature was anything but deeply national, and then applause, that writers must draw on national springs. The stuff of literature was homemade, always must and would be. The writers did suit their own countries. A Scotsman was a Scotsman and an Englishman was an Englishman for all that. I find this very interesting that in this first kind of launch event, as it were, the event which kind of separates and creates a new Scottish centre, there's this tension between, you know, the emphasis that Carl has just talked about the internationalism of Penn, and this focus on national identity, national rivalry, which was obviously very much in people's minds. But also that's partly, I think, because there was this clear sense of national pride in an organisation which people felt would be a key forum for showcasing Scottish culture internationally and engaging with international literature and culture. And that becomes very clear when we look at what happens, I think, in the 1930s. So could we move on to the next slide, Gerry? So just really briefly, because I'm conscious of time here, I'm not going to read through all of this, but if we look at the kind of events that were going on there, probably about 6 to 9 events each year, celebrating figures of Scottish literary past, but also interrogating the contemporary culture. So there were, and I think it's really interesting that in 1929 already there's a debate which is headed, is Scottish Penn any good? So already they're beginning to question what the function of the organisation is and what it's doing for Scotland and vice versa, I guess. And also a sense that, you know, there's clearly a social dimension to the club, but there's a push amongst many of the members, you know, that to coordinate intellectual activities. So there's a sense that it shouldn't just be content with social activities, but and there's a nice phrase here, it should quicken the literary life of Scotland. So this actually should be catalytic in its impact on the institutions of literature and culture. So there are events, there's a move in fact to try and set up a university press, a Scottish university press, as well as a national book week in Scotland. There are talks on the humanities. So a lot of Scottish focused talks, but also an event on the poetry of Yugoslavia, on the concept of freedom in literature. And an interesting talk would look like an interesting title, How Far is the Vernacular Essential to a Scottish Renaissance? And you can kind of hear the influence of some of these figures like McDermott perhaps behind that. And it looks like the attendance at many of these was reported around average of 50 people, so pretty well attended too. And the members included by that stage included people like Edwin and Willem Muir, Lewis Spence, Marion McNeill, a lot of people who are associated with the Renaissance of the 1930s. And obviously the crowning of these activities in the 30s was the 1934 Congress, which took place in Edinburgh, like the subsequent Congress. And that clearly was a statement from Scottish Pen and a kind of showcasing of literary, kind of contemporary, prominent literary figures of that Scottish Renaissance. So there's a program for the Congress which has a couple of essays, one on Gaelic writing in Scotland and the other which is really just kind of an overview of the exciting developments in Scottish literature of the 30s. And clearly 1934, there was so many things happening internationally, politically, that were being debated at that Congress. So there was a kind of dual focus, both on the literature of Scotland and lots of debates on, and this is reported on fascism, Hitlerism, communism, political prisoners. Marinetti was actually at the conference as well. So there were a lot of heated debates, which I look forward to writing up in the longer piece. But just going on to the next slide, Gerry, I just, drawing attention to the next president, which was Herbert Greerson. And again, he brings a kind of quite an academic kind of stimulus to the events and sees the organization as the basis for a series of kind of symposia in which the literature of Scotland, and it's very literary, the focus during this period, should be examined critically, both inside and outside Scotland. And as he says, the intellectual horizon in the north, so long hampered by servility, he has a vision for it widening so that the desire of those intimately concerned with Scottish Pen, that their international contacts be strengthened. So he has a kind of strong international vision for the organisation. And where possible, the Scottish consciousness should become an inherent part of international life and experience. Just the next slide quickly. And just to, kind of as I've come to the end, give you a sense of the numbers here. So I don't have figures for all the years, but these figures I think give you a sense of the rising membership, which is steeply rising in the 1930s. And you can see by 1934, and then perhaps following the Congress, a kind of peak 1930s membership of 184, so 36 new members, and then obviously it begins to fall quite steeply for very obvious reasons in the 1940s. Just the last slide, thanks, Gerry. So just to finish with a few kind of questions and reflections. I think we can see that the formation of the formatory years of Scottish Pen, you can see it clearly, kind of hear the ambition and the confidence in promoting Scottish knowledge of Scottish culture at home and abroad, whilst also building in a structural kind of acknowledgement of Scotland's diversity, both linguistically and geographically and in terms of literature. But further evidence of what's happening in terms of the events suggests a real tension between that founding recognition and the pull of the centres of Glasgow and Edinburgh, which proved to be quite irresistible at various points, I think. But the formation of Pen is quite clearly crucial to the 1930s Scottish Renaissance, just as Pen was also, and its members were crucial to that Renaissance, with the 1934 Congress being a clear point of crystallization, I think. a diminishing membership in evidence in the 1940s. But I'm wondering whether, in fact, the Congress of 1950 had a similarly kind of galvanizing effect on the post-war Congress. So that's a question that I'm going to pass on to my colleague Gerry, who's going to be speaking next. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Helen. I'm just going to fiddle here to try and get my slides up. Oh, that's your slides. We've done those. There we go.
So just while you're doing that, Gerry, just to remind people that we are, I think I'm probably guilty of speaking over time there as well. So we're scheduled for this paper to finish at 3:15, but I'm guessing that's going to be about 3:20 now, Gerry.
Yep.
And then we've got a break scheduled, so hopefully we'll all be able to de-zoom for a few minutes.
Right. Are my slides now apparent on the screen?
Not yet, no.
Oh God. Right, sorry, hang on. Advanced sharing options. Who can share? Only host. Multiple participants can see. I'll give it one more try, and then I may have to go on without being able to share. Let's just see. Is anything coming up now?
Not yet, no. I'm just also investigating to see if I can do anything. Screen share. I think we're in business. I think. Sorry about this, folks. That's it.
That's it. Thank God. Right, and I will also try and do the thing you showed me. Slideshow. Oops. From beginning. There we are. So, as Helen was saying, we've fairly arbitrarily divided up the historic terrain as we've gone into the archives. And I'm more or less covering the history of pen from the 1950s. In some ways, though, as I'll try and explain a little bit, I think the real changing point is the 1970s, because the generation of McDermott, essentially, that Helen was telling us about, are still very much in evidence, at least until the 1970s, the true believers, if you like, in the Scottish Renaissance movement of the 1920s and 30s. And before moving on to historical and indeed perhaps epistemological kind of matters, something more basic about the archive. Mario Relic and others have done a wonderful job in providing a checklist of the pen archive, which now resides in the National Library of Scotland. I suspect not all pen members, perhaps not all members of the board, know this, but the pen material is actually owned by the NLS. And before anyone is alarmed, that I would argue is a good thing, because increasingly repositories are loath to take in material, and there is an opportunity to add more pen material in the future. And actually, I think we as pen, Scottish pen, now need to be thinking about doing that, because there is a fall off in the material that's archived. If we think about the period that I'm more or less covering from the 1950s, there are around 70 subject files in the archive. It is not complete, and that's no surprise given the hard-working organisation that Scottish Pen is. To give one example, we've got a fairly complete applications, a set of applications forms for admission from 1936 to 70, which is a real goldmine of information about the membership and other things, and then these seem to disappear. I don't for a moment want to suggest that Scottish Pen hasn't had its accounts audited since 1991. I know it has, but the archive really shows accounts audited down to 1991 and AGM minutes down to 1998, and the 1978 committee minutes seem to be missing. This is very typical for a hard-working organisation full of excellent volunteers, which doesn't have an entirely professional setup. And I think it's true to say that maybe I'm only speaking for myself until recently, the 21st century Scottish Pen hasn't perhaps thought much about its archival footprint, and we maybe need to return to that as a matter of allowing ourselves to apply for funding in future in terms of compliance, all kinds of things, as well as documenting and archiving our own history, which is good in itself. Again, a very brief example, something that Carol alluded to and something that has emerged in my research, not all that surprisingly, as perhaps an overwhelming strength in Scottish Pen and Pen internationally, working with writers who've been imprisoned, mostly imprisoned falsely. I could give you a list of writers I would like to be sent to prison for good reason, but most of the guys in the Scottish Pen archive have been imprisoned falsely, and there are very good files on these, especially through the 80s and into the 90s, and I think that's interesting. I'll maybe come back to that. There's a lot of detail on international pen congresses, as Helen has mentioned already. And so there's a whole number of things you could do with the Scottish Pen Archive and the NLS in terms of our own local history, if you like, and much wider things. The other thing just to put out there is the danger, and this is common to many voluntary organisations and associations at this moment in history, that we are losing our memory because of the online, the digital age, because of emails rather than letters, etc., etc. It's an obvious point, but we need to be mindful of that. And that's part of the reason that only yesterday, Helen and I were recording interviews with Mario, Jenny and Carol for the archive, so that we've got that personal testimony for posterity. Helen has mentioned that she and I are writing 2 essays, which more or less will comprise a history of Scottish Pen. But since starting my research, I've realised that Pen has to feed in to 2 other projects that I'm currently working on. I'm editing the Blackwell Companion of Scottish Literature, which will come out in 2022. And I've also very foolishly agreed to a 300,000 word Blackwell Encyclopedia of Scottish Literature for 2023. Thank God I don't need to write all of the words. But what has become apparent to me is that Scottish Pen is more important than I thought, more admirable than I thought. And it's important to say that as a prelude to a few perhaps slightly humorous comments I might make about the history of Pen as we go on. But the fact is that Scottish Pen has been a hugely important institution in Scotland's literary life. And that now needs to be reflected in, if you like, the mainstream histories, the big histories, as well as hopefully what will be quite detailed history that Helen and I are going to write in these articles. The parameters of that history before 1950 and certainly since are, in a sense, again, quite obvious, strikingly international. There's quite a bit of material where people, thank God, are taking on the racist South African state. There is quite a lot of material where Scottish Pen and Pen internationally is defending writers imprisoned in the Soviet bloc. But the point I would like to make is that what this history shows, although we need to be careful about oversimplifying, is that once upon a time the enemy of free expression was quite easy to identify. And arguably it's much more nebulous in the 21st century. And I think in some ways Carol has alluded to that already, talking about defamation and hate speech. And I might say just a wee bit more about that toward the end. But the departure point from that is to say that, again, a fairly obvious point, but we need to grasp this, identity politics is now in the mix with state politics. and that is making for a much more complicated terrain in the present, and we need to understand some of our history as we approach that. Carol quoted from the Penn Charter, and I've given a wee extract from it here, which interests me for a number of reasons. I'm broadly on side with it, which no doubt comes as a relief to my fellow board members, but the International Penn Charter of more than 100 years ago, effectively, says that literature is national in origin, but knows no frontiers, tick. It is common human currency, tick. The patrimony of humanity at large, well, you wouldn't get away with that word patrimony anymore, and perhaps quite rightly. And also, all of this relates to the ideal of one humanity living in peace in one world. I think probably most of us here, I'm assuming, would agree to these principles broadly. They all sound entirely commendable. But I was slightly depressed, but also interested last week chatting to a writer who I won't name, who's a very good writer and quite sort of at the cutting edge of all kinds of things. And she said to me, "Oh, Scottish Pen, you know, it's a bit colonial, it's white, bourgeois, etc., etc. I'm not sure your ideals count anymore." Now, I actually think they do count, but that gave me pause for thought, because again, a historical point of departure, including in the language that I've just mentioned, and the overall concept for Penn internationally, is that our vintage belongs with the League of Nations, which of course is defunct essentially with World War II. And I admire the League of Nations in all kinds of ways, but that moment over a century ago, when Penn internationally was founded, that really gives us a venerable history, but also in terms of our foundational ideals, perhaps should make us think about what our mission statement is and what our mission is in the modern world. What you can trace in the archives is Scottish Pen, in common with other international pen centres, attempting quite commendably to help pen centres become established in Russia and in Africa. And again, this writer that I mentioned said to me, "Oh, the whole business with Africa, that was kind of colonial." Now, I don't entirely believe that, but I think we need to think very carefully about it. But these big things that are happening in Scottish Pen and elsewhere from the 20s onwards, certainly way beyond that, from the 50s down to the 90s, perhaps down to the present, these big national things are great, and for the most part, dealing with big issues. And then if I kind of rather pathetically collapse that a wee bit, what we also find in the archives are much petty disagreement on the rules of the Scottish Pen Centre, so that these are changed 3 times in 1956. What we also find, and I say this with Glaswegian neutrality, the Edinburgh centricity of the associations around Penn. It's quite remarkable that in brochures in the first phase of Penn and beyond, for national congresses, international congresses held in Scotland and for other events, people would say, "Well, I know so-and-so, I went to the Royal High School with him or her, the Sir Walter Scott Club, the Bank of Scotland, the Ladies Caledonian Club, I'll phone William Grant up, editor of the Scots National Dictionary." And there was a kind of networking going on that was, you know, very much, certainly down to the 70s and even into the 80s, very much the great and good of Edinburgh culture, making things work. And to be fair, they made things work very well and according to good liberal principles. Also, the relationship with the National Trust of Scotland, because once upon a time we met at Gladstone Land, and there's a bit of debate from the 70s onwards about where Scottish Pen might meet. But to some extent, you could argue there was a kind of a cosy middle-class existence in some ways, which was effective and in some ways necessary in that pre-internet age to make things happen. Now, in 1953, the aforementioned William Power dies. Power is interesting. He's one of several leaders of the Scottish National Party in their time who were part-time leaders, who had day jobs and also found time to do a lot of pen work. You couldn't get Nicola Sturgeon these days to come onto the board of Scottish Pen. That's maybe a shame, but it just wouldn't happen. William Power, journalist and former leader of the SNP, leaves £613 and 2 shillings as a trust fund to Scottish Pen, worth just under about £20,000 today, and especially that goes towards endowing the Frederick Niven Prize. And this is one of the things I'm going to be writing up as a kind of mini case study within my essay. The Frederick Niven Prize is awarded very patchily each year by Scottish Pen, or was. And among the winners were such wonderful books as Archie Hind's The Dear Green Place, Alan Sharp's A Green Tree in Geddy. More recently, we had the likes of Alan Massey being awarded it. Now, as far as I can work out, what's going on here is that the Frederick Niven Prize is endowed because people like Power are looking at the James Tait Black Memorial Prize, founded in 1919, still one of the best literary prizes in the English-speaking world, and that has a lot of money behind it. But by and large, not many Scots have won the James Tait Black Memorial Prize, and that's fine. You know, it's all's fair in love and war. But clearly, people in Penn in the 50s and 60s began to think, let's have a different kind of prize, a more modest prize, but something that will do something much more locally. And I think Frederick Niven was chosen as the patron saint of the prize, if you like, because we've got a man who's born in Chile, who resides part of the time in Canada and in Scotland, writes about Scotland and Canada and Africa. He was a suitably international writer with a particularly humane sensibility, even if largely forgotten today. That prize at various points, as I've mentioned, isn't awarded, and the Scottish Pen boards, none of whom are here today, from the late 50s. At one point, clearly, they had lost the deed for the Power Endowment and get into huge trouble with Her Majesty's tax services, and no award is made for 5 years. And the mechanics of that are quite interesting. And the man who's emerged very much as a hero to me in reading him at Penn is Nigel Tranter. Nigel Tranter, when he dies in 2000, makes the news, and one Scottish writer goes in the news and basically says, yeah, wrote not very good historical novels, not a particularly important figure. And it was clear to me that this writer had read no Tranter, and it's even more clear to me from the archives that Tranter is formidably important to Scottish Pen and beyond. He is the man who sorts out the Niven Prize so that it's back being worked again. He is the man who uses his networks to keep things going through the 60s and 70s. And the point that was sort of sitting in front of me that I'd never quite grasped, the Pen activists from the beginning, and certainly through the midpoint of the 20th century, they create all kinds of other things following on from Scottish Pen. Some of you might remember the formidable Honorary Secretary, Mary Baxter, who goes on to work at the Scottish Book Trust. Tessa Ransford, who founds the Scottish Poetry Library in 1984, involved with Pen thereafter, but also before. Scottish Pen is the cornerstone that inspires the Pen membership to go out and do these other things. Mary Baxter, I spent ages reading a bit of the correspondence that probably won't make it into the essay because it's not all that relevant. But poor old Clifford Hanley doesn't pay his dues for 2 years, and Mary Baxter gets a hold of him, and he damn well has to surrender up the 2 years' dues plus a wee donation. Nigel Tranter is a formidable committee man, and during his time especially, we see increasing attention to things like translation, etc. But Pen, during this time, with its network of things to do with Scottish literature, is very active in these broad spheres of languages, generally, translation, literature, and embedding these things further within a discourse of human rights. And also emphasize a lot the exchange of these things, of ideas and expression, something that Carol touched upon. The campaigning is overwhelmingly impressive. Sometimes people might think that volunteer organisation can be a bit ramshackle, a bit chaotic, and probably that's true. But what leaps out of the archive is the campaigning for writers in prison, writers at risk, almost through the entire history of PEN. It's hugely impressive. And these letters and campaigns make a difference, literally help people prevent them from being executed and so on. Governments listen to human rights organisations like Scottish PEN and PEN International, even the most reactionary ones, not necessarily for good reasons, but because of PR reasons. There are a couple of points in the recent Scottish PEN history, or fairly recent history, that I'm just going to touch on and sort of put out there, because I've got a lot more research to do on these. 1975 is an interesting year because there's a lot of fruitful interaction going on with places like the Hungarian PEN Centre. And okay, this is 18 years after the Hungarian uprising, etc. But there's discussion with them about so-called terrorism and resistance and so on. There's some discussion with Australian PEN about boat people and so on. And PEN during this period is trying to get its head around terrorism, frankly. We have the International Congress in Israel in 1974, and Scottish PEN, like others, are clearly very nervous. They're rightly appalled by the massacre of Israeli athletes at the Munich Games in 1972, etc., etc. But everything is a bit confusing in the sense of some of these terrorist groups might, in a sense of a point, might be left-leaning, as Scottish PEN broadly was. But how do you take a compass on this? It's very difficult for Scottish PEN and other organisations during this time to sort out the good guys and the bad guys and the limits of protest, etc., etc. All of that by way of preamble to another mini case study that I'm going to work on, including hopefully getting archived to previously embargoed files in London next year, concerning the notorious Major Boothby, leader of the Tartan Army, not the choir at Hampden cheering on the Scottish football team, but the frankly terrorist group that attempt to interfere with oil supply lines and electricity. That's Boothby there, with the sun shining on him, the more elderly gentleman leaving Glasgow High Court. And Boothby ended up being imprisoned for 3 years on terrorist charges, quite rightly. The jury's out on whether he was a double agent. Hugh Mcdermott was paranoid about him, but that tells us nothing, because Hugh Mcdermott's paranoia should never be taken on trust about anything. He might have been a double agent, he might not. He might have been a sincere fascist nationalist. He founds, incidentally, the 1320 Club, which is prescribed by the SNP, and very much is a promoter of the Scottish Liberation Army, which used to terrorise readers of the Daily Record in the 1970s. He begins by being an associate of Hugh Mcdermott and Douglas Young. There's Douglas Young there. And Boothby makes a cameo in James Robertson's wonderful novel And the Lands Lay Still. Now, what I find fascinating is that Scottish PEN write letters appealing for Boothby's release, and I can't get to the bottom of this. And at one point, they reckon that they might be able to get Lionel Dykes to defend Boothby. PEN are pulling out the stops. Now, this is because of the aforementioned generational thing. Douglas Young, although a bit younger than Mcdermott, is very much the kind of next generation down. And although Young had died in 1973, people around Young, I think, are still influencing that discussion. And it's a strange moment in Scottish PEN history, the attempt to stand behind Boothby. But that's one for future investigation. I'm going to push on because time is running away with us. I want to make a point about the new generation in Scottish PEN from the late 70s, or at least some things that change. Scottish PEN's campaigning becomes much more intensive, much more focused, And I don't know if this has to do with increasing media technology, television and so on, much more immediate news. I'm not sure about that, but the campaigning steps up, and it is absolutely impressive. I admire Scottish Pen even more than I thought I did. What we've also got, though, from the late 70s is a new generation of Scottish writers who are much less at the centre of Scottish Pen. I know, obviously, by definition, we've got writers still in Scottish Pen, but the kind of, in some ways, the most Ken Speckle Scottish writers are less at the centre. And that generational change seems to be from the late 70s, and that's worth some investigation. 1997, for the third time, Scottish Pen hosts an international congress in Edinburgh, and we've got the emphasis on women's writing. There are 11 files in the archive, which again is a case study. Increasingly, from the early 90s, we've got the Hutcheson lecture, and just want to note that race and gender, really from the 70s, are the start of Spen's engagement with identity politics. Neither of these things are necessarily divisive, but now we've got, perhaps, arguably, more complicated identity politics over sexuality, etc. What we've got in many ways, although Scottish Pen remains international, we've got a move from external matters pertaining to freedom of expression to internal matters, is the way I would express it. And trying just finally to put a wee bit of sense, a wee bit of structure all round of this, which is going to take a lot more particular investigation. My provisional conclusions, which are quite obvious in a way, is that Scottish Pen has been a striking hub throughout its history, both of cultural nationalism and cultural internationalism. It's campaigned for personal freedom, people actually imprisoned, and also freedom of expression. And that expression is political, it's opinion, expression of opinion, and it's also literary and linguistic over minority languages, etc. But we've now got new frontiers. Once upon a time, Scottish Pen, like other international pen setters, comfortably sat within a model of multiculturalism, even before that term was invented. In the new age of identity politics, we perhaps in some ways have more of something that might be called uniculturalism, even in the liberal West. And again, this relates to defamation, hate speech, etc., etc. The one strand that runs through all of this that has to be engaged with, and Scottish Pen remains at the centre of these discussions, albeit that it's a more complicated concept in some ways these days, is the idea of democracy. So a lot to be filled out properly on the historical record, and a few bits of simple analysis and potential conclusion that are going to have to be further essayed for the work we're going to do when we write that fuller history of the first centenary, more or less. We move towards 1927, the foundation of Scottish Pen, as we move towards that in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerry. That was fantastic. Really, so much information there, and a lot of insight into the archive as well, which is fascinating, which I'm sure people will be interested in. So I think if it's okay with everyone, we're going to have a short break now. I know people will probably be gathering kind of questions and points of interest that they might want to probe a bit further, but we're going to bring those to the panel session at the end. So if we can have a break, we're slightly overshooting ourselves on time. So our original break was 3:15 to 3:30. We're almost at 3:30. So what do you think? Shall we give ourselves until about 3:40? Does that sound okay? 3:40? Brilliant. Okay, so we'll reconvene at 3:40. Is that all right with you, Jenny? And we'll be kicking off with your paper or your talk at 3:40. Brilliant. Thanks. Okay, see you all then. I can see a few people still making cups of tea, Gerry, so we'll give it.
Yes, I think we should capture Scottish Pen President Carol MacDougall showing us how to make a cup of coffee for the archives. Helen, I think your volume has gone just a wee bit again. Do you want to say something?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. That's a wee bit better. It seemed to dip again. It became good. I don't know what it is.
I think it must be just something maybe to do with the broadband or something, because
could be.
I haven't really adjusted the settings, and the volume's up full on my keyboard. So.
No, that's fine.
Okay, we've got Carl back. I think David's.
Yeah, and the main thing is if Jenny's back.
Yeah, I can see Jenny. She's already got a cup of tea organised.
All good.
Jenny, you're on mute, so I can't see what it says. Walking something. Walking the dog. I'd rather be walking the dog.
Can you read it?
Does it say I'd rather be walking the dog?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Well, hopefully the rain will stop after this and you'll be able to get out with the dog. So
the sun is shining. The sun is shining.
Oh, good. We sent the sunshine through then. Yeah. Okay, I think we should probably start. I know I can see a couple of empty rooms, but hopefully once we start, people will join. Hi Jane. So I'm going to pass on to Jenny Calder now, our fourth speaker today, who I'm sure Jenny is known to many, if not all of you already, as a former president of PEN, as well as an extremely distinguished writer of many literary histories and biographies and studies of Scottish literature. So Jenny is going to talk about, today is going to talk about the milestones for PEN or SPEN since 1990, and obviously from her own particular view as an insider and as a former president. So very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Welcome, Jenny.
Well, thanks very much, Helen. The first thing I want to say is how much I've enjoyed the talk so far, and how much I have learned from them. They've really been quite inspiring, and underline how valuable I think this afternoon is for all kinds of reasons. Well, as Helen said, this is a personal view, and it draws on my own experiences, or some of my own experiences, of Scottish PEN, which I joined in around 1984. I apologise for being vague about dates, but although I'm not sure of the exact date, I remember very well the occasion of being accosted by Jim Ford, who was then president, and almost aggressively saying, "Why aren't you a member of Scottish PEN?" I very quickly joined. At that time, there were occasional events and social gatherings, and Scottish PEN was a regular presence at the PEN International Annual Congress and at Writers for Peace and Writers in Prison conferences. By the time I became more involved in the 1990s, Paul Henderson Scott was president, and preparations were underway for Scottish PEN hosting the Congress in Edinburgh in 1997, which has been mentioned, with the theme of identity and diversity. Hosting Congress was a very big deal, which involved a detailed master plan and an army of volunteers, and it couldn't have happened without huge effort from Paul, his partner Laura Fiorentini, and Mary Baxter, who's already been mentioned, who was at that time treasurer and membership secretary. It was a major milestone, as each of the occasions when Scotland hosted Congress, a major milestone for the organisation, an opportunity to bring writers together from all over the world, and also to promote and to present Scottish writing in a Scottish context. The Scottish pen had always played a significant part internationally, always punched above its weight, I think, from its very beginnings. But hosting Congress was a very significant boost to its profile in Scotland, and was very important for that reason. By this time, by the 1990s, Scottish Pen was increasingly active as a campaigning organisation. Its Writers in Prison subcommittee was probably its strongest section. Robin Lloyd-Jones, who followed Paul Scott as president, was particularly energetic in leading the committee's support for imprisoned and threatened writers. But the 1990s also saw the formation of the Scottish Women Writers Committee, which immediately set to and produced a poster which featured 100 Scottish women writers, many of whom, possibly most of whom, were forgotten or almost forgotten. And the annual Naomi Hutcheson lecture was inaugurated in partnership with Glasgow University, and the marking of International Women's Day became an annual event, and an increasingly important annual event, I'd say. When I joined the committee in the 1990s, Scottish Pen was doing more than ever, but it still had no office, no permanent abode, and the president and office bearers and committee members acted as administrators, press officers, fundraisers, event organizers. Everything had to be done by volunteers. So we were working from living rooms and kitchen tables, files and papers piled up, telephone bills escalated. And just referring back to Gerry's comment about the rather the gaps in the archive, I think this is one of the reasons there are pieces of Scottish Pen's history scattered all over Scotland. And I think it would be excellent if we applied ourselves to how to gather together some of this material, and probably join it with the archive in the National Library. Our membership was increasing, but only gradually, and this has been the case ever since I've been involved with Scottish Pen. We set up our first website. That was a big milestone. Our international status was recognised with Scotland, but in Scotland we were very aware that we really lacked the high profile that, you know, from what we've heard so far this afternoon, I think we've had in the past, and which is really essential to sustaining the work of Scottish Pen. Another significant step forward was the initiation of a Baltic Writers' Exchange, which was the brainchild of Simon Berry, who became president after Robin Lloyd-Jones. With support from the then Scottish Arts Council, he visited Riga to set this up with Latvian Pen, and in 2003, Donald McLaughlin was selected to represent Scottish Pen and Scotland in Riga, where he spent 6 weeks meeting writers and publishers and partaking in events. A return visit to Edinburgh was made by the young Latvian poet Inga Gale. The plan was that this should continue. We saw this as the start of something that would involve other Baltic countries. And Simon and Donald were both keen to keep it going, but unfortunately funding was not forthcoming and it just wasn't possible to sustain the project. So there were times when progress felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but the dual need to support writers under threat and to reach across borders, of course, didn't subside. How could we strengthen Scottish Pen, build its presence in the Scottish as well as the international literary scene? We found there was widespread ignorance of Pen in the Scottish literary community. I encountered people who thought it was an exclusive club, and it has to be said, it kind of started out as an exclusive club. People who thought that membership was by invitation only. They knew all about Amnesty International as a campaigning organisation, but not about Pen. And there were others who expected Pen to be akin to the Society of Authors and thought it would offer advice on contracts and help with publishing and marketing, that kind of thing. So the challenge was not just to make people aware of Pen, but to be clear on what Pen was about. Tessa Ransford became president in 2003. The committee agreed that our priority was to secure a permanent base. And this became Tessa's mission. And anyone who remembers Tessa will know that when Tessa had a mission, there was no stopping her. And it was duly accomplished when Edinburgh City Council provided Scottish Pen with space for an office in the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh. We took possession of our new home in 2005. This was another huge step forward, and we do remain continually grateful to Edinburgh City for continuing our rent-free residency. Tessa also secured funding to equip the office, which was equally important. Anyone who has visited the Scottish Pen office will know that it is tiny. Nevertheless, it has often been occupied by 3 or more people working literally cheek by jowl. Do we need a bigger office? Yes, we do. Though, of course, since March, with the closure of museums, we've not been able to work in the office we've had. So we've kind of gone back to the kitchen table. In the years that followed 2005 of milestone projects, but much work was still being done in the homes of committee members and others. Scottish Arts Council funding enabled 3 CDs to be produced, featuring prose and poetry from 36 contemporary writers. The first, Border Crossings, was distributed to Scottish secondary schools and also taken up by the Scottish Government for international distribution. The CDs were taken to Congress for presentation to attending delegates. This was a great way of just making available and accessible some aspects of contemporary Scottish writing. The Arts Council also awarded funds that enabled us to employ a part-time administrator. That was another step forward. It eased the burden on the committee of a lot of the donkey work that is involved in keeping an organisation like Pen going, and generally helped to set us on the road to becoming just that bit more professional. In 2007, I took over as president. This was the year of our 80th anniversary, and to mark that, we organised an exhibition which opened in the Writers' Museum and then travelled around Scotland. 10 years later, a second exhibition travelled widely in Scotland to mark our 90th year, arriving at the Scottish Parliament in November 2017. As part of those 90th anniversary celebrations, we published I'm Coming With You, an anthology of writing from Scottish Pen's online magazine, Pennings. 3 years earlier, Scottish Pen had taken another big step forward. In 2014, Scotland hosted the Commonwealth Games with a supporting cultural programme. Scottish Pen was awarded funding to organise Scottish Pen Presents, a series of events in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Crieff, Alloway, Dundee and Stornoway, which brought together Scottish and Commonwealth writers. The funding allowed us to recruit paid staff to run the project. And this ambitious project changed the pace and productivity of the organisation almost overnight. We became a larger presence on the literary landscape, and as a consequence, we're under pressure to sustain that level of activity. And arguably that pressure continues and grows. The more we do, the more there is a need to do more. But fundraising is a key to all this. Creative Scotland funded our next big project, Many Voices, which brought established writers together with marginal groups around Scotland to write and perform their work. The funding enabled a necessary increase in part-time staff, and it has to be said that their enthusiasm and commitment were absolutely essential ingredients of the project's success. But at the same time, of course, other areas were demanding attention. There was no let-up in the work of the Writers in Prison Committee. If anything, the threat to writers and journalists around the world was and is increasing. An important event in Scottish Pen's calendar is the annual marking of the Day of the Imprisoned Writer. And in the last 3 years, this has been hosted by the Scottish Parliament, which is, again, a real boost to Scottish Pen's profile. And last year, 2019, it was hosted by the First Minister in Bute House. The Writers in Exile Committee has been producing pennings since 2009, featuring writing from pen members and refugees, asylum seekers, and exiles in Scotland. The Women Writers Committee joined with the University of Edinburgh's Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities to organise an annual International Women's Day event, always well attended and always thought-provoking and generating a real buzz. Really good, excellent, stimulating occasions. And recently, the Writers for Peace Committee has been energetically revived with a series of readings in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Paisley and Wigtown. I hope I haven't left out anything in that list. But Scottish Pen isn't just about readings and talks, important as they are. An increasingly prominent strand of our work, as you heard from Carl, has involved the reform of defamation law. And this project has been enabled by funding from the Joseph Rowntree Community Trust. We've been able to make a significant contribution, as you've heard, to the proposed reform of defamation legislation in Scotland. It is crucial for PEN to be involved in these discussions of free expression issues, including hate crime and cyberbullying and all that is linked. And associated with this has been the work with libraries by the Defamation Project's former manager, Nick Williams, to produce a digital security and privacy toolkit. As has been mentioned, this year saw the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath, and to mark this, Scottish Pen invited contributions to the proposed anthology of poetry and prose on themes of freedom of expression. The result Declarations on Freedom for Writers and Readers, was published by Scotland Street Press. Unfortunately, the pandemic put paid to the planned launch in Arbroath and to a whole series of other events, and including at the Edinburgh Book Festival. But the book itself is a reality and is a fascinating and wide-ranging expression of many aspects of the theme, featuring writers from both Scotland and overseas. So we've come a long way in the last 20 years, and there's no doubt that we have a more visible presence in both the Scottish and the international literary community. The importance of our work has been recognised by the Scottish Government. When Scottish Pen was born in 1927, it was in the hope that an international organisation of writers could help to make the world more open to creative ideas, to become more collaborative, more receptive to inquiry and exchange. There's still, as is self-evident, there is still much work to be done. The nature of the organisation means that although we now have 2 much valued part-time staff, much of that work will continue to be carried out by members who give voluntarily of their time and their skills. Speaking personally, that work has been hugely rewarding and has led to many memorable experiences and encounters. The opportunity to meet writers from all over the world at international congresses and conferences in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Ohrid, Berlin, Linz, working on the CDs with Vice President Fiona Graham and poets and fiction writers. I beg your pardon, that's my dog barking. Poets and fiction writers from Scotland, planning future development. Quiet. Planning future development with the late David Panning. I feel I must mention his name because he was such a committed and generous supporter of Scottish Pen. Planning and drafting text for the exhibitions, working on International Women's Day events with the University of Edinburgh, and generally being involved in an organisation that is committed to facilitating writing and reading and liberating silent voices. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Sounds like your dog was greeting the delivery of the post there, perhaps, Jenny. Or
well, I don't know what it was, but I think she's trying to tell me it's dinner time.
Yeah, that as well. Thank you very much indeed for that. That was a very rich overview of those of those decades, and again, lots of great insights into the period that you've covered. Could we maybe pick up again? We'll pick up on some of that in the questions, I think, and the question session, which I'm increasingly thinking, given our numbers, might be more of a kind of open forum rather than a panel, but we'll see. Can we move on now to you, Mario? Are you ready to go?
Yes,
so
I certainly am. Yes.
You're unmuted.
Yes. Yes. Okay, shall I start?
I think yes, just go ahead, please. That'd
Okay.
be fantastic. So I obviously need to slightly introduce you.
Oh yes, yes.
Everyone probably knows you already, but just in case not, this is Dr. Mario Relic, who's been a member of PEN, I think, or on the board, in fact, for nearly 2 decades, or certainly for
no, it's actually since Jenny, sometime in the middle of Jenny's, so that's, I'm not sure how many.
Okay, I knew it was post 2000 anyway.
Yes.
And so Mario is going to talk about some of the dominant or kind of notable personalities in Scottish Pen, because Mario has also been involved in quite a lot of archival research at the NLS. So I'm drawing on that. So pass on to you, Mario. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. First of all, my personal thanks to Carl, Helen, Gerry, and Jenny for their enlightening contributions. Now, my own is just, it's more of a weekend supplement view of certain personalities. Past. In fact, I should have called the talk Past Scottish Pen Personalities. But anyway, so let's start. I'll start with Hugh Mcdermott. Now, Helen, of course, has told us quite a bit about Hugh Mcdermott, which I'm glad about, because I'm giving, well, if Mcdermott can be compared to the moon, I may be giving more of the dark side of the moon here. But anyway, Hugh Mcdermott was instrumental in founding Scottish Pen in 1927 and was its first secretary. However, he had a rather turbulent relationship with some of its key members, reaching its lowest point when his long poem Welcome to the Pen Delegates was published in the periodical The Modern Scot, just in time for the 1934 International Pen Congress. And Helen, of course, has talked about Congress. This is how Alan Bold, Mcdermott's biographer, describes it. Composed in Dryden-esque couplets, Welcome to the Pen Delegates dwells on the incongruity of staging an international event in Scotland. Mcdermott poured scorn on Scottish critics and condemned three of Scotland's literary lights, George Blake, Compton Mackenzie, and Lewis Penn. Now, perhaps he was most unfair to Compton Mackenzie, since for a time they were great friends and actively involved in the early days of Scottish Pen. Mackenzie was prominent in both Scottish Pen and nationalist circles, never bore him a grudge for this rude mention, and they remained lifelong friends. Mcdermott's wife, Walter Trevelyan, on the other hand, referred to the poem as that stinker of yours. Regarding Mackenzie, it appears that Mcdermott objected to his buying a property on the island of Barra, the model for the island in his best-selling novel Whiskey Galore, calling him the second Bonnie Prince Charlie, and possibly behaving like a minor laird, or as the title calling him the second Bonnie Prince Charlie, and possibly behaving like, sorry, line here, or as the title from one of his novels, the Monarch of the Glen. Mackenzie also attracted hostility from D.H. Lawrence for similar reasons. Short story, The Man Who Loved Islands. Blake's aphorism, opposition is true friendship, undoubtedly applies to Mcdermott's relationship not only with Mackenzie, but also with Scottish Pen. You could say it was patriarchal in an Old Testament kind of way. Patriarchs always know what's good for you. The Modern Scot, the periodical, also published an extract in 1933 from We Have Been Warned, a political novel by Naomi Mitchison. Mcdermott wrote a warm letter to her in which he praised the prose rhythms of a marvelous description of the Hebridean seas. Mitchison wasn't a member at the time, but she joined in 1938. Some have criticized Scottish Pen, somebody mentioned by Gerry, in fact, for being too bourgeois. However, at least the politically left-leaning Mitchison, who belonged to the aristocratic Haldane family, was anything but bourgeois. Now, William Power has been mentioned by Gerry, but I think it must be emphasized. Well, first of all, he wrote his entertaining autobiography, which has a lot of information on Scottish Pen, with Old Acquaintance, in 1937. And he was a committed member. But his greatest importance, I think, is his vigorous defense at the 1928 Congress in Oslo of Scotland's right to have its own pen centre, thus establishing the principle that any national group can have its own pen centre, whether it comprises a state or not. Power's lasting legacy can be seen, for instance, in the exiled Uyghur pen centre based in Kazakhstan. Helen B. Cruikshank was a poet who wrote both in Scots and English. Her Scots poems, in Alan Bold's words, drew on her upbringing in Angus. Mcdermott always stayed at her family home when she was living with her mother in Carstorphine, and he came down to Edinburgh from Montrose, and she was one of Mcdermott's closest friends. The tiny room reserved for him she dubbed the Prophet's Chamber. She succeeded him as Secretary of Scottish Pen. One chapter of her 1976 memoir, Autobiography, is about the 1934 Congress, the same one McDermott criticised. She was more positive and nuanced about the Scottish Pen contribution. She claimed in her memoir that a wild party described by Eric Linklater, himself a well-known novelist and member from Shetland, I mean, in his 1934 comic novel Magnus Merriman, as a thinly disguised Scottish Pen party. Alan Bowles records that she continued to give McDermott moral and material support throughout his island exile in Shetland. And on hearing that he had been conscripted for national service in 1941, used her professional influence as a civil servant, which was in London, to prevent the poet being employed as a manual labourer on the roads. Instead, she arranged for him to undertake engineering work. Incidentally, McDermott has been unfairly criticised for his poems about the London Blitz. I mean, he did contribute to the war. He didn't stay out of it. The Orcadian Edwin Muir was a very fine poet, and second, perhaps, in my view anyway, only to McDermott, the 20th century Scottish poet. He and McDermott clashed over the cultural politics of the Scots language, but I would like to focus on his wife, Willa Muir, who collaborated with her husband in translating Kafka. She was also the author, hers is generally acknowledged as the greater contribution, partly because she was a gifted linguist. She was also the author of a fine novel, Imagined Corners, published in 1935. She and Edwin Muir were delegates to the 1932 International Pen Congress in Budapest. She had this to report in a letter to Helen Cruikshank, where you can see they were, they all knew each other anyway, you can see. The prize for the best Hungarian book was awarded by the then existing Pen Committee, a book which everybody admitted to be really a good book. The government, however, intimated that this book was not to get the prize. It was merely a study of peasant life and in no way furthered the chauvinist aspirations of Hungary. But that was the least of it. She goes on to report various atrocities meted out to political dissidents. Willa Muir's letter refers to Admiral Horthy's authoritarian government, but it could just as well have been describing the direction of travel under the self-styled illiberal populist Viktor Orban in Hungary right now. In 1987, Muriel Spark received honorary membership of Scottish Pen. In her speech of acceptance, she said, as reported by Paul Scott in his 2002 autobiography, A 20th Century Life, that from her experience as a woman of Scottish background, she believed that the principles of Pen are especially natural to the Scottish character. Independent-mindedness, its will to sincerity in public affairs, its sense of being unquestionably born free. Her words seem to me perhaps the greatest tribute the Scottish Pen ever made. And then Jenny has talked about, I would just like to mention that he was influential in getting the Macros Court memorials done, Writers' Museum. And he did it by what Gerry before called networking in Edinburgh. Mainly by getting in touch with, who was it again? He was the Herbert Coots, at the time Galleries and Museums Director of the City of Edinburgh. And then Jenny mentioned Tessa Ransford. And I'll just finish with an anecdote. Paul Scott records that Ian Crichton-Smith made the main speech at the formal opening of Macros Court in the summer of 1998. I'll end with an anecdote about the Lewis poet who wrote authoritative poems both in Gaelic and in English, as well as novels and short stories. I have it on good authority from a well-known Edinburgh poet who knew him. He once confided to him that, much to his disappointment, he had inadvertently lost a silver pen memento, which had been presented to him in honor of his brilliant, often witty and heartfelt work.
Thank you very much for that, Mary. That was great. I particularly enjoyed your kind of focus on those early years as well. There's
Yes.
some really good leads that I'll definitely follow up on those autobiographies and biographies. Thank you very much for that. And so that completes all of our presentations. We now have actually still have 45 minutes or so until we're due to finish. So we've got a space now for input, conversation, questions. I think we were going to have a panel. So I'm not sure what your view of this is, Gerry. What do you want to kind of just have a?
Oh, yeah, I think as you suggested a wee bit earlier, Helen, let's have a free-flowing conversation. And I think anyone who wants to open up any of the issues, ideas, any of the 5 papers, I think let's just have the conversation begin. If people could maybe signal if you know how to put the yellow hand icon up to make a contribution.
Yeah, the yellow hand, or even just put a question in the chat function if you're able to access that on the right-hand side of your screen. We can pick up questions. There's David. I know this. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I'd just like to, I guess this is the big question and maybe we can't give an answer, but people have been, I've been fascinated by today. It's been fantastic to get this kind of background. I think maybe I didn't know enough about PEN, although I'm on the board, so that tells you something. What's the direction of travel over the next few years, ideally, you know, to make us more relevant, not colonialist as we seem to be perceived? You know, more digital. How are we going to reposition ourselves so that people know more about us and care about what we do? Is that too big a question for one debate?
I mean, if I can just make a wee response to that, Dave, I think there are 2 things, and this is from within the narrow ambit in a sense of me looking at some of the history. One of those things is we should know more about our own history, our own archives, and that's part of getting as organised as we can, although that's difficult in all kinds of ways. And the second thing, I wouldn't presume, especially in front of people who've been on the board and members of PEN much longer than I have, to suggest what we should definitely do. But the one thing I'm convinced we should do, we need to have a frank and fearless discussion about our aims and objectives. And going back to, you know, the likes of the PEN Charter and saying, let's just talk about what our mission is, what it should be going forward. And I know there'll be a range of views on that, but arguably there's maybe not quite enough of that. We do. Scottish PEN does lots of brilliant things, and activity sometimes doesn't allow enough space for thought, even though it's a very thoughtful organisation. But maybe we need to create a space for discussion, simply.
Thanks, Gerry. Thanks.
Right.
Yeah.
Gerry, thanks for that, and thanks for everyone who's spoken. I've learned so much more about the organisation that I thought I was a part of, and I now realise I'm a part of something much more complex and exciting than I even thought it was. So thanks for everyone for that. Gerry, your bit about the archives is quite interesting. And we have very little 21st century archival content. I'm wondering if it's possible to present this as a project at Edinburgh University for one of the students from the history of the book. It might be something to do as and Professor Tom Mole, I know, is on a committee out there. I could speak to him about it because I suspect it's something that one of the students would really enjoy, not just because of the fact collecting, but because of the ideas that go around all our archives and what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Joyce. And the wider point, in a sense, is that in this day of interns at universities and elsewhere, without exploiting anyone, there are lots of people who want to develop employable skills for publishing, for archives, and maybe we should be, you know, the way forward is always partnership. Edinburgh University, Glasgow University, other places. More and more universities want work placements, internships. Absolutely. So we should, you're absolutely right, we should do more on that.
So I'll bring that to the next board and we can discuss it, and I'll discuss with Tom whether that's a possibility, but I think it could be. And as you say, there perhaps could be somebody in Glasgow could do it as well. But obviously that is quite exciting. And I think it's important to understand where you've come from before you can decide where you're going. And I agree with you there. I think it's terribly important.
Also, I was just going to say, it was interesting, I think, was it Jenny who said that a large part of the archive is dispersed into different, different people's libraries, and so that kind of activity might flush some of that out, and people might come forward to make copies of materials that they're holding privately.
Well, it would create quite an interesting research framework for a student to create, I think, in archives that are dispersed. I think it's got unique challenges there. So, yes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the challenge of gathering together material from numerous different locations, and much of it, if my vast stock of Scottish Pen materials, anything to go by, is not terribly well organised. It's an interesting but definitely a challenging project.
I think it's something that we could appeal to the membership for.
Yes.
I'm quite sure that, for example, most of certainly since I've taken over, most of what I do is done by email and is done by telephone conversation at various times of the day and evening. However, what I do think is that nevertheless, I do have some written material, especially notes for events and stuff like that. And I'm quite sure, as I've been suggested, that past members of the board would be willing to share some of that stuff. But even generally, I think that what I'd like to see is some members who haven't particularly been at the centre of Pen, but who nevertheless have been part of Pen, giving their voice to what we've done, giving their voice to have to say, and sharing their memories. And I think it's definitely something that we could appeal to the membership to, that we could put it up on the website, that we're looking for this. But more importantly, I think it could run in a series of newsletters, maybe for a couple of months and then miss a month and then keep going, with a kind of continual reminder that in actual fact our past is really important, and that our membership is as much a part of that past as anybody else, and that what they have to say is absolutely important.
You could have a From the Archives feature as well. There's a lot of juicy stuff in there.
Yeah.
And beyond the material that we have in the NLS and that members hold, I've realised in the course of my researches there's a kind of a ghost archive, or is it where the other side of the correspondence, a lot of Scottish writers have correspondence with Pen, and that material is sitting in their individual archive, often again helpfully in the NLS, but not always, so that you could actually write a full-scale cultural history of Scottish Pen, and it would be a rather interesting monograph for someone, not me.
When I did the Willie Souter Centenary exhibition in 1998, I came across a lot of this material going through Willie Souter's correspondence. And the first thing that struck me about Willie Souter's correspondence is that it had been quite judiciously, but nevertheless edited, that we didn't have a full archive of his letters, especially his relationships with many other people. But nevertheless, there was enough there, and certainly that would be one place where I think people could be looking at.
Yeah, I'd like to mention something about Willie Souter. There's an interesting letter from McDermott during the war where he'd been to Souter's funeral and there were no Scottish Pen members at it. And he was disappointed. But then he thought, well, maybe it's because of wartime conditions.
Which is slightly a stray thought, but my good pal Alexander Linklater, Alex doing the new biography of McDermott, and I speak to Alex fairly regularly, and he must be covering the Pen thing. Maybe we could try and get him to do a talk for Scottish Pen on McDermott and the early days.
Did he write a biography of Compton Mackenzie?
That was Andrew. That was Alex's uncle.
Oh, I see. Right.
Say to Alex, hello from me, and certainly, I would be interested to hear what he has to say about that. Yeah.
There's also, do you know Dorian Grieve?
Dorian,
Yeah, so he might, I know he's, well, obviously he's collected a lot and collected the letters, and he might have some additional pen-related information or documentation.
Can I just make another comment? It's that a couple of times over the last 2 or 3 years particularly, we've managed to move the organisation back into a position where it does touch on very central things. The Media Freedom Conference Summit that was held in Edinburgh was one example of it, where I think, you know, there was a lot of interest generated just over a good idea which we put on, and it really did touch a lot of people. The Bruce Bachani thing as well was just, you know, it's an international event, you know, and it was great that PEN had something to do with it. I think that we've moved quite far over the last few years, something towards what, you know, a more sort of I don't know how to say it, more contemporary sort of thing or something. So, you know, whatever it is that's been done over the last few years, I think has helped a great deal.
Thinking about the archives of Scottish PEN and the history of Scottish PEN, I'm sure one of the things that that has happened recently is that we've collaborated with other organisations who may be seen as kind of fellow travellers, you know, obviously NUJ, obviously the Saltire Society. And I think that a glance into them would give us quite an interesting perspective on not just the contemporary situation of PEN, but our history, because our paths must have crossed in the last 90 years or more, assuming that, you know, however many, certainly let's say 50 years, they must have crossed more than once. And that people who were member of one organisation would be members of another. And I think that this is something where, again, I mean, it's just this, you know, how big is a hole, you know, that you keep on digging. I think that rather than looking at things which are specifically PEN, I'm sure that we could get quite a lot from looking at other organisations and their relationship with PEN.
Yep.
So are there a lot, you mentioned the newsletter, Carl. Is that a kind of regular thing?
Yes, it is yes. We what happens is that one of our members, Mary McCabe, puts out a call towards the end of each month, usually around 27th, 28th, saying send stuff in. She then brings this compiled material across to, across to Lisa, who compiles our newsletter. And it goes out to all membership. All members get it at usually actually quite, you know, on the first of the month, actually. Lisa's pretty adept at that sort of thing. I don't know where she finds the time, but nevertheless she does. And you know, I think it's an interesting series of documents, actually, to see the way that especially in the last, well, certainly since I've taken over, you know, especially in the last while, to see the reflection from the PEN membership of what they've been doing as well as other things. You know, many of them say that somebody's doing a reading somewhere, someone's doing a talk somewhere, you know, and I think that it's generally that sort of personal news rather than news about PEN, but nevertheless, there is news about PEN that is in there, you know. That obviously, you know, when we're looking for something, we appeal to our members. And give our members information. For example, we have recently instituted whereby people can make monthly contributions to PEN. That is a banker's order every month rather than paying off the subscription fee all at once. And we told our members that, A, by putting it up on the website and also through the newsletter.
And are those archived somewhere, or what? So that happens electronically as like a mail.
I'm utterly convinced that there will be archives for that, Helen. Yes, there will be. In actual fact, what I'll do is I'll take a note of that. And amongst the one or two other things that have cropped up today, I'll mention this to Lisa on Tuesday.
Well, that'd be great. As I'm just wondering when it became electronic, and there's probably a pile of print versions of those somewhere in the.
Yes, there are. The newsletter goes way back. It was different, but the print versions were almost entirely about Scottish Pen activities and achievements. But I myself have quite a number, but it's not a complete collection. In theory, there is a complete collection of the print version in the office.
Right, that's I thought it must be somewhere in the office, but I expected to find those in the NLS, I think, and I couldn't see any. Yeah.
Well, related to all of that, Mario might know the answer to this. Is there a particular curator in the NLS who's got responsibility or oversight of the Scottish Pen Archive? Do you know?
Yes, there is someone, but I can't quite remember his name.
It was Sally Harrower.
Oh yeah.
But
well,
I'm not sure if it still is, or indeed I'm not sure if she's still.
She's not, Jenny. Sally retired
Sally,
a year ago at Christmas. Colin McElroy has taken over.
Right.
So if that comes under Colin's aegis, we should be having a discussion with him about continuing the archive.
Absolutely.
Colin I know very well. I'll maybe have a chat with him.
Gerry, we also wondered if they might be across the road in the public central library.
Because there is the Edinburgh room in the Central Library. I don't know if they have archives of any kind.
And I wondered at what point as well, because I was using the Pen News letter as it's quite a valuable resource because they had that regular Scottish report, and I wondered when that stopped, and presumably that just stopped, and because it, but I don't know when that happened, because there was like the monthly update from the Scottish Centre along with all the other centres, which was quite informative, but presumably that just the Pen News itself stopped, and but I don't know when it stopped, because I could only find copies of it up to the late 40s.
Well, it seems to be replaced by the monthly newsletter, which is not very detailed, but just what's going on.
But I couldn't find that either. So
you can't find a newsletter.
I couldn't find it in the British Library, which is where I thought it would.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had to leave you there. I had to. The door. There was a rat-tat-tat in the door, which you may have heard. Anyway, I went round to see what it was, and it was a neighbour who was asking me if the hens had yet been fed because she has some food to give them. So I just wanted to share with you that our hens are well and happy, and I'll be going up to see them afterwards. Don't worry about that. I assured her as well.
Well, they're good layers.
Can I just make one more comment? I was really interested in Jenny's comment about the things in which she's been involved, and it's led to other things. You know, it's been working with writers internationally and things like that, Jenny, which you found very stimulating and enjoyable. I mean, it's quite interesting to think of Pen not just as a sort of clearinghouse for what's going on, but a way of creating new stuff, and the means by which writers engage with each other. You know, they know each other and do what they love doing through Pen. So it's more than simply a reporting organisation or something that just sort of brings together what's happening. It's actually the means by which new things are constantly being generated, and that's very valuable. You know, that's something that an aspect of that maybe isn't always made clear.
Absolutely, and it is valuable both on a personal level and for the organisation. It's the exchange of ideas, the exposure to other people's experiences, and just the personal connections. Really valuable, as I say, for personally for individuals, but absolutely vital for the organisation. And I think in many ways that kind of international connection with writers all over the world has had a huge influence on the character of Scottish Pen, and has made Scottish Pen more visible in an international context, which is also obviously very important for the organisation now and in the future.
Yeah, totally.
I'd like to mention another possible archive, namely Tessa Ranford's archive at the University of Edinburgh. Might have information on.
Yeah.
Is that held in the university library?
It is, yes, yes. In the rare document.
Yeah, but the Centre for Research Collection.
That's the one, yes.
Yes. And we have a new director who's just come with us in the last few months, and he's very keen to be engaged with the wider community. So I think, yeah.
Can I just thank everybody? That was really fascinating. I mean, really. I thought I knew a little bit about the history of Scottish Pen, but I know nothing now. I realise. So I really appreciate the time and effort and research and consideration that people put into it. And I really would love to see more of these events happening, and hopefully at one point we could have a more a face-to-face one when things are change. And I really do think there's a big congratulations in terms of the history of Scottish Pen. I think the involvement in the work, in particular I can sort of speak for the Writers at Risk work. There's been such a history of huge campaigning work and personal commitment to that work, and in terms of hours and time and energy. And just on my time of taking over the sort of Writers at Risk group, there was Lucia, a writer, Chinese writer and artist, was released from, I think she had a period of release from house imprisonment, and she fled China to reach, to get to Berlin and then get to the States. I think it was on the anniversary of her husband's death, Lucia Bow, about a year later. And when she thanked Pen Centres, she thanked Scottish Pen for their commitment to her campaigning work.
Yeah.
I've just had an email from Australia from one of the Writers at Risk centres there, who was asking about how we structure ourselves and how we work. And you mentioned Bruce Buchani again, Carl, and there's been thanks from him and from that kind of concerted effort and that networking. And that came from Congress. I met Diana Cousins and other Pen members from Australian Pen Centres. And if that gathering together hadn't come about, like Congress, then we wouldn't really get to know how we can help each other and support each other with our different campaigns. And I really also think Gerry's point was important, just the latter one, about us coming together to sort of reflect and think about things and think about the history and think of what has not changed and what has changed,
Yeah.
and where we need to be kind of placing our focus, and where we need to move on from here. And there was just a minor point in terms of the PEN International Charter, that the quote, Gerry, is also the patrimony of humanity at large should be left untouched. Sorry, talking nonsense here. Champion the ideal of humanity, living in peace and equality in one world. So that, because I think also Scottish PEN has been kind of focusing a bit more on equality issues, and certainly we got a significant sum of money for our Many Voices project, based on marginalised voices and inequality of pertaining to certain groups. So, but I do think that as you were saying, Gerry, I think there needs to be a kind of stopping and reflecting and thinking about how we combine the kind of equality issues with freedom of expression, and how we understand these kind of different strands, because they've kind of almost entered into our work and we're kind of running with them. And I do think it's time to sort of take stock and think, well, wait a minute, in what direction are we going, and how is this influencing the work that we're doing? But congratulations to everyone. It was so informative and so interesting. To me. So thanks again.
No, thank you. And I mean, I think, as I was saying, I knew that PEN was very good, but I tell you one thing, you immerse yourself in the archive. I was blown away by the volume of excellent, successful campaigning. If you want to renew your love affair with Scottish PEN, go into the archives. But then beyond that, there is this point of us in the here and now, and actually the discourses of human rights and equality and diversity issues, which broadly I'm on side with. The whole dynamic has changed, and not just for Scottish PEN, but for society, for culture, Western culture at least, and maybe beyond. And we haven't really begun to grapple with the implications of that, and not to get into recent fraught history. But for instance, we've had a couple of cases recently where Scottish PEN members are on different sides of the argument, and there's nothing wrong with that in principle, but some of these arguments potentially are a bit toxic. And at that point, I think at the very least, we've got to think, what do we stand for? And it's not to say we stand for only one thing, but how are we best able to mediate or help facilitate discussion, indeed freedom of expression, when our own membership sometimes has very different views? And I wouldn't want to legislate those different views away, but it's a wee bit worrying sometimes in all kinds of spheres, the partisanship and things like no platforming. So, how do we deal with all that? There are no easy solutions, but we need to have more explicit discussions about that, I would suggest.
I think that's absolutely true, and discussions not just within Scottish PEN, but in the wider Scottish literary community, and in the wider international literary community, because we're not the only ones who have to deal with these issues. I also just want to mention again, because I mentioned in passing David Perney, and there's still I think two or three people on the board who will remember him. He was so valuable to us because he encouraged us to focus, and just the way Gerry has been describing, on what we are about, what we should be about, what our priorities should be. And I still go back to the couple of development days we had with David, because they were so valuable. And I think it's worth going back to them and reminding ourselves of some of the discussions that we had and some of the conclusions that we came to, and that could be a starting point for just re-examining some of these issues and looking properly, maybe for the first time, at some of the the newer issues that have arisen since those few years back when we were having these discussions with David.
Mm.
Yes, I think
I agree entirely, and as board members will know, we did actually plan a development day earlier this year. It was on the cards, and it was going to happen. In fact, we'd even sought out a location, but like everything else, Corona intervened. But I don't think that should necessarily mean that we should postpone it for very much longer. I think that really what today has proven that we can actually meet, and our board meetings have done, and I've shown this as well, that we can actually meet together and we can actually do this. And I think that with a proper agenda, I think that we could, begin to move forward with this. I think the will is there, and I think that what we really need to do now is to put it into practice. One of the things that I've found really interesting today is the fact that how contemporary much of the history sounds. That it just seems as if we're kind of continually fighting the same things, and and with different people. But one of the things that struck me forcibly and continues to strike me is the general ignorance that there is about Scottish Pen. And I think that that's something which, of course, we constantly look towards trying to improve upon and trying to reach out. And while one of the things that the symposia have done is precisely that, is that we have had people who otherwise you wouldn't see dead at a Scottish Pen event coming in and joining in what's going on. Perhaps the free coffee and the free sandwiches are a little who can tell, but none of them looked as if they were exactly impoverished. But however, the fact of the matter is that the more that we can do to actually reach out to other people and to bring that, at least to let them know what we're doing, never mind anything else, I think is more than worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Will we maybe draw things to a close, or is that a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we were at 27, I think, are a high point today. Which was fantastic, and we're down to a significant 12. So thank you to all of you for staying with us, and thank you for your input into the really kind of productive and fascinating discussion at the end. So I think we should say watch this space. Really, Gerry, do you have anything to add?
Just to add to your thanks, Helen, to say this is very much a work in progress and hopefully a starting point for more events and indeed more formal writing up. And, this project is something we're trying to do in a historical sense for its own sake, but we do hope that it very much feeds into, we always hope that it feeds into Scottish Pen's sense of where it is now. And I think I've been very heartened by the discussion to feel that that this discussion is part of that. So that's it seems to me to be hitting the right spot. Thank God.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Could I just say thank you, especially to Helen and to Gerry, for the work they're doing and telling us who we are and reminding us of where we've been, and hopefully that will give us some focus about where we're going. The other thing is this, that on Wednesday and yesterday I was discussing with Lisa ways of putting this onto the website. This seems to me a significant thing that's been going on here, that if we find out things about our history through it going, how else would that be what else could that be but of interest to our members? And I think that what we really have to do is to try to get it on the website, get at least something of this on the website to begin with that can be added to. And I know that will happen quite soon. So I know that Lisa will be next week, I think, reaching out. And so even the points that you made, the bullet points that were there or whatever, something that we could put on the website that can begin to take forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks also to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for giving us the money to do it.
Yes, very much. Thank you.